Okay, so welcome to part 2, and this is where we're going to go through some of the theories. So I discussed labelling theory, but labelling theory is actually more of a sociological theory as it is society and other people that labels them. But what is a psychological theory of crime? Well, it is about the individual. So what is psychology? Focuses on the person. Social theories focus on broader social structures and the environment and community and everything like that. The scientific study of the mind and behaviour is what is used to describe psychology. So the research is trying to understand and explain how we think, act and feel, what's going on in those little heads. Applications can take a clinical form. Clinical is where you are sitting talking to someone. Organisational is working within businesses. It can be figuring out how offices can be set up to get the best out of people. There's a lot goes in there. Educational, working in schools. That's the field I wanted to go into. Forensic psychology, working in the court system, and health and community psychologists who work in the community. There are an awful lot of areas of psychology, and here they all are down the side. So abnormal, biological, neuropsychology, evolutional, cognitive, developmental, and developmental usually goes with educational. It's usually called Dev and Ed. Social psychology and personality psychology. Now, not all of these are going to be applicable to crime, but each of them are a branch of psychology. So if you wanted to do one of these, you would do your undergrad in psychology and then you would be doing your master's or your PhD focusing on one of these areas. And, you know, neuropsychology would be people who can work in hospitals with those people who have unfortunately suffered brain injuries. There's a lot that goes on. So forensic psychology, which you will do next trimester, this is examining aspects of human behaviour directly related to the legal process. So police psychology, working with the police to conduct their their psychological assessments that they do to decide whether they can become a police officer or not. Also, dealing with police who've been through really traumatic experiences and helping them. Criminal psychology, working with criminals, making decisions about their behaviour in court. Victimology and victim services, obviously working with victims. Psychology and the courts, so providing information to the courts as a specialist. And correctional psychology can be working in the prisons. You can be working with prisoners, doing programs for their rehabilitation, doing risk assessments on whether they're ready to be released, and all those sorts of stuff that they do. So they can be working with sex offenders, murderers, all sorts of people within the prison system. Okay, applying. So these are the 4 that we're going to look at today. You will need to know these for the exam, know basically a bit about them all. And on your third assignment, which is another short answer, one of these could be the basis for your third assignment question. Okay, biological theories and crime. Genetics and heredity. Well, that's what's passed down to you from your parents. Depression and cancer, these things are all heritable. So if you remember back a few years ago, famous actress Angelina Jolie, she had a double mastectomy due to the history of breast cancer in her family, and the chances of her catching it were fairly high. So she had them both chopped off, as it were. So hormonal or neurobiological, these are things that happen in your brain, such as serotonin, dopamine, and others. These are the things that make you feel good, things that make you come down, things that make you go to sleep, things that make you go up. Environmental factors, where do you live? What's going on around you that can affect you as an individual? And evolutionary psychology. This talks about what's happened tens of thousands of years ago that is still in our psychology today in some people. And it can make people more prone to being impulsive and aggressive, as opposed to people who are more cautious, because in the hunter-gatherer stage, people would have acted quite impulsively and needed to act aggressively in order to save themselves at times. whereas others will be cautious and show social control and social cooperation. Okay, so biological theory is looking specifically at you. And when we look at hereditary, we look a lot at twin studies. Okay, so twin and adoption studies is where they find twins that have been separated at birth and grow up in different families. Then they go back and have a look at whether they have become criminals, were the adoptive parents criminal, were the biological parents criminal, were both twins criminal, and then they compare them along the lines of them being monozygotic or identical twins, which is always 2 boys or 2 girls, or whether they're fraternal or dizygotic twins, which means 2 boys, 2 girls, or a boy and a girl, but they don't look the same. So how this is explained is like this: monozygotic or identical twins share 100% the same genes, so they are genetically exactly the same. Whereas dizygotic twins are no more alike than any of you are with your biological siblings that you are not twins with, so it's 50%. The concordance rate is the extent to which a twin exhibits a trait or behaviour if the other twin exhibits it. And in this case, we're talking about where one twin is criminal. If in half the cases their twin is also criminal, the concordance rate is 50%. Twin studies find that concordance rates for crime are considerably higher for monozygotic than dizygotic twins. Okay, so there has been a lot of twin studies done. It's not easy to do because you've got to go and find twins that have been adopted out at birth separately, find both of them, and then get agreements for them to be parts of studies. So this is not an easy thing to do. And there was one of the Nordic countries many years ago was actually doing something where they were deliberately taking twins and putting them in different families to study them. You would never ever get ethical approval to do this anymore. And they can look at other things too, apart from criminal traits, things like health problems, their mental health, and things like that. But if you go onto YouTube, you will find any number of stories on there about twins who've been adopted out and found each other and couldn't figure out why people were calling them by a different name, and found how much they've had in common. So I read one story once about 2 blokes in America who were adopted separately at birth. They were identical twins, and they kept going into town. They didn't grow up too far apart. It was in rural America, and they kept both of them getting called by the other's name. And when they finally met each other, they found out that they both had the same job. They both had wives with the same names. They'd given their children the same names. Even their dogs had the same names. And they just found out how much they actually had in common, to the fact that they both wore flannelette check shirts that were exactly the same. So these are the kinds of studies that they do. And the most famous of those is called the Minnesota Twin Study. And that's what this YouTube clip is all about. And I would urge you to now go and just watch that before we move on. Okay, welcome back. I hope you've watched that video and enjoyed finding out a little bit more about what happens in these twin studies. So hereditary can help to explain the intergeneration transmission of crime. So what does that mean? Well, it means where parents who are offenders have children who are also offenders. But we have to keep in mind here that parents and children share more than just the genes. They also share same environment. So can environment affect criminal behaviour? Well, children learn mostly from their parents. And if the children see their parents displaying antisocial attitudes and behaviours, then they're going to do it too. We've all seen, well, I hope you have, stories about women who have their children in prams and they go into shops and put stuff in the prams and just walk out the door. The children will see that, and that behaviour will become normalised for them. So adoption studies are there to help us tease apart genes from the environment. We cannot say that genes 100% are affecting it here, but there is evidence to support it, as you saw in the video, especially with the adoption studies of the twins. So children with a criminal biological parent who are raised apart from the parent are more likely to offend than adopted children whose biological parents aren't criminal. It was Scandinavia that did a lot of twin studies and even deliberately separated some to study them, but you could never ever do that in a million years anymore. So together, twin and adoption studies point to the possibility of a genetic foundation, but there is no such thing as a crime gene. There is no specific marker when they do DNA testing that is a crime gene. Neurobiological development. This guy in the photo here, his name is Adrian Raine. He looks at CAT scans, MRIs, fMRIs to study the brain and study changes. So neurobiological changes which occur over the life course may increase or decrease the risk for involvement in crime. For example, adolescence, the brain changes so much, and sometimes the body can just grow at a great rate and the brain just doesn't keep up with it because it matures just a little bit slower than the rest of the body. This supports the age crime curve that says that crime will occur a lot in adolescence and then subside for the vast majority of young people. So they do something once or twice and then they desist. And remember, I talked about labelling theory. If these kids are going to just do something silly and stop, we don't want them to be labelled as criminals and affect them for the rest of their lives. We want them to go on to be successful law-abiding citizens. So that, there's a lot of antisocial behaviour that goes on in young people that just ceases and desists when they get older. Things like, and even down to things like promiscuity in both genders. It's more common in adolescence than it is when they get into their 20s and the brain matures just a little bit. So what can cause neurological impairment? Well, neurological or neurobiological impairment can result from many things. So alcohol and drugs consumption can influence your brain behaviour. Being exposed to environmental toxins such as lead, which for you as a generation being much younger than me is not there as much as it was when I was growing up, because when I grew up, all petrols had lead in it, paints had lead in it, and that's all being taken out now. So that exposure to lead as a toxin is not as common as what it was. Acquired brain injuries, such as car accidents, assault. Another big one there is actually ex-football players, people who have played sports where they're using their heads a lot. Worse, believe it or not, in the American football where they wear the helmets, they get a lot of brain injuries in later life. And in Australia, they're doing a lot of testing on ex-footballers, but it seems to be AFL players that are coming up with the most change in their brain function from playing football. But this is an individual level theory. So the effect of acquired brain injury is going to be different from one person to the next. And this is where your neuropsychologists come in to work with these people. The effects of alcohol and drug intoxication. People showing poor judgment, disinhibition and aggression, which may heighten the risk for offending and for being victims as well. So these people are not just going to be offending, they are at risk of being victims as well. So damage to particular areas of the brain, which may result in significant changes which increase the risk of offending. So increased impulsivity, aggression, anger and hostility, and decreased social skills. Domestic violence, homicide, suicide from having CTE, and CTE is the head knocks from playing sport or from having lots of concussions from fighting, for instance, so boxers as well. It's been in the news quite a bit about 6 to 12 months ago, because an AFL player died and he actually asked them to look at his brain after he died, and he was found to have CTE. Another famous rugby league player called Steve Folkes died of a heart attack, but when they did the autopsy, he was also found to have CTE and had had heaps of personality changes during the years before his death. And there's another AFL player who's now been forced to retire early due to multiple concussions, and he has said that he will donate his brain to research after he dies, so that we can look at these things. So, you know, domestic violence where people get hit in the head all the time, attempted suicides or people committing suicide because they have changed from having a neurological impairment. So here is, I'm just going to stop for a minute and let you read this. But this is about lead exposure and how it can lead to changes in IQ, violent crime and unwed pregnancy. Please pay particular attention to the red bits. So this is probably the abstract or introduction to a journal article where they have done some research. And if you look at that title, it really would grab you and draw you in to read what they're going to say. That's the person who wrote it, that's the year it was written, the journal that it was in, the issue and the volume. Okay, so in Queensland, we still have children in Mount Isa who show high lead levels above what they should show. It's getting better, but it's still an issue up there. Lead was taken out of petrol because of the problem with petrol sniffing. So it was a very big problem with teenagers who were sniffing petrol to get high, and subsequently some of them have ended up having some quite severe brain damage. So the lead was taken out of petrol for this reason and out of paint. And some of the reasons that some paint can only, at one stage, could only be bought by adults aged 18 and over was because of the lead levels. Now the paint's locked up to stop them from graffitiing. But it can affect an entire generation of people who've been exposed to these toxins. And this graph gives you a bit of an idea of what happened. Okay, you can see the concordance here where the lines kind of follow each other. So USA average preschool blood level as their blood lead level, as the lead in their blood went up, so did the violent crime rate. Okay, and the violent crime rate there in purple is just from 98 to 2013. As the lead level in their blood came down, so did the crime rate. Okay, so it's just showing that something as simple as getting lead out of the environment made a difference to the crime rate. All right, behavioural theories. So we're going to do two here. These are learning theories. You've got classical conditioning and operant conditioning. The first one is the Pavlovian conditioning, which is classical conditioning. Now, Ivan Pavlov was not even a psychologist. He was a zoologist, and he was measuring saliva rates in dogs in the early 1900s and came across classical conditioning quite by accident. So please watch the video. The person in the video is, I can't think of his name, but he's very famous. He did the Stanford Prison, Milgram, oh no, I've forgotten his name, terrible. But he did the Stanford Prison experiment, and you'll see his face a lot more all the way through. So to give you a bit of background on classical conditioning, it was about dogs learning when they heard footsteps or saw the dish they were going to be fed, so they began to salivate before they actually got the food. Anyone who's got a cat will know that if you get the tin opener out and start the tin opener on the can, even though there's mainly ring pulls these days, cats will come running because they'll hear it and think it's dinner time. If you have got little ones and you count when they misbehave, they will know they've been naughty and know what's coming. So it's conditioning people. So please watch that YouTube clip and then we'll talk about it a lot more. Okay, so from watching the clip, you will see how accidental or unplanned associations between two stimuli can result in learned associations. So in the case of the dogs, they learned that when the person was coming towards them originally, that meant that they were going to be fed. They started to pair the food with the bell, and eventually when they heard the bell, they started to salivate because they associated that with being food. Now, the result is that food aversions and phobias that people have got can quite often be explained by them being classically conditioned by something else that happened. To give you an example, I caught a tummy bug as a kid, and the night before we'd had sausages for dinner. I couldn't eat sausages for years, but it probably wasn't the sausages that caused me to be sick. I probably just had a tummy bug. Okay, so 5 steps to change it from an unconditioned stimulus to a conditioned stimulus. So in Pavlov's dog, the presence of the food was the unconditioned stimulus that produced salivation. So you give them the food, the unconditioned response is that they will salivate. The unconditioned response is often an emotion or a physiological response that occurs without thought. So the dogs can't control that salivating. That is just what happens when the food comes to them. The neutral stimulus is the stimulus that produces no special response. So this was the bell. So they paired the bell with the food and it was the neutral stimulus. Over time, the neutral stimulus can elicit the unconditioned response. So he paired the sound of the bell with the presentation of the food. The bell was the neutral stimulus. The presentation of the food was the unconditioned stimulus. And after a number of trials, the dog began to salivate at the sound of the bell without the presence of the food. So now the neutral stimulus, which was the bell, becomes the conditioned stimulus because by itself it is producing the response, and the response becomes the conditioned response because it's happening after the conditioned stimulus. So then the salivation becomes conditioned because it's happening in response to the bell. When we get to the tube, we'll do some real life examples so you can see how this works in real life. All right, operant conditioning with B.F. Skinner. What an interesting looking man. So this explains how behaviour is shaped by receiving reinforcements and punishments. So this is a little bit different to classical conditioning. So the easiest way to remember this when you're trying to study for exams is that positive is always giving something and negative is always taking something away, just like a battery. So reinforce good behaviour and punish bad behaviour is the idea here. So a positive reinforcement might be your parents giving you $10 for going and mowing the yard. That is a positive reinforcement. You've done something good. You receive something in response to performing that behaviour. Negative reinforcement can be the removal of an aversive stimulus in response to performing the behaviour. So you told your child to get off their iPad and they didn't do it as fast as you asked them to, so therefore you are removing the iPad. So both positive reinforcements and negative reinforcements serve to increase the likelihood of the behaviour being repeated. With negative reinforcement, you want them to do what you've asked them to do, so you are removing something in order for them to perform the behaviour. Okay. All right, so punishments serve to decrease the likelihood that it will be repeated. So positive punishment can be something like if you come to class late, I give you a smack. So positive means that you give something. A smack is a punishment, so it's a positive punishment. A negative punishment is the removal of something. So removing a favourite toy. It could also be if you get caught speeding, removing your licence. So it's negative, it's taking something away, and it's a punishment. So you're taking away something that people like. Okay? Both positive punishment and negative punishment decrease the likelihood of a behaviour being repeated. Now, when you're doing these punishments, they have to be done quickly. You can't do it 10 minutes later or wait until your dad comes home, because otherwise it's lost its impact. Okay? They exert most influence when they occur immediately after the performance is performed, after the behaviour is performed. Okay, so if you delay it, you're increasing the likelihood that it can be associated with other non-related behaviours and therefore fail to shape the target behaviour. But how is this theory of crime? Well, the idea is that people might think about committing a crime and the consequences before doing it. Okay, here is an example with the mouse in the box. So up the top, we've got something given to the mouse, something taken. So something given, positive, positive, something taken, negative, negative. Increases the likelihood of repeated behaviour, decreases the likelihood. So we have the mouse in the box, there's a speaker, there's a red and a green light, there's a lever and a dispenser and an electrified floor. If we can get the mouse to press the green light, food will come out. So that positive reinforcement increases the likelihood that the mouse is going to keep pressing the lever because something was given to them, which was food. Okay? If the mouse presses the red light, however, they're going to get an electric shock. Okay, so it's positive, they're getting the shock. It's punishment because they're getting the electric shock. So it's going to decrease the likelihood of the repeated behaviour. Negative reinforcement, something taken from the mouse that's bad. So there's a loud noise. But when they press the lever, the loud noise will stop. So we're going to take away the loud noise and increase the likelihood of them repeating the behaviour of hitting the lever. And there really isn't a negative punishment that you could apply in this scenario. I'll leave that to you to come up with something. I don't know if you can do it without killing the mouse. Okay, but that gives you an idea. But I find it easier to think about the fact that positive is giving something, whether you're giving something good or giving something bad, and negative is taking something away to increase or decrease the likelihood of the behaviour reoccurring. Okay, we're going to move on to social learning theory, and this is one of the really, really big theories in criminology. So we're talking here about cognitive theory, so the thinking and feeling of the person. And this is about how we all grow up and how we observe and make sense of our social environment, and that's learning. So there's lots of different types of learning, and one of those is called vicarious learning. And this is where we can see someone get a reward for doing something, so we might internalise that and do it too. Now, what we're watching them getting a reward for does not necessarily have to be something good. We could watch someone go into a store and steal something, and they walk out, they've got something really bright, shiny and new, and there hasn't been any punishment for it or any consequences. So we have vicariously learned that we can do that too. So modelling behaviour, very, very important. If you don't know how to smoke because you haven't watched anybody do it, how do you learn to do it? You can't go and get a book from the library, how do I smoke? So modelling behaviour of adults to children becomes very important because that's how children learn. So this is where all their self-concepts are formed, through social learning, through watching other people, because children observe how others respond to behaviour, and behaviour is modelled. So, for instance, when one of my little grandsons, when he was about 2 and talked far too early and too well for his age, he heard his father say, "Fakook." He said fuck. He was out in the garage, Archer wasn't there, And Archer came down to our place a couple of days later, and he was upstairs, and Poppy and his mum heard him standing upstairs going, fuck, 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 fuck. And he just heard somebody else say it, and so he was just saying it too. His mother tried to convince Poppy that he was saying truck, but he was not saying truck. But in those cases, if you just ignore that, it will just go away by itself and not keep going because he's not continuing to hear that all the time. But imagine that it's in a home where children are seeing violence and aggression all the time. That's the behaviour that's being modelled to them, and that is the way that they may grow up. So think about people who get involved with drugs. How do you learn to roll a joint or inject heroin? How do you learn what behaviours will get you what you want? So you see something happen and the outcome, internalise it and do it the same way. Now, one of the early experiments that was done in this was what's called the Bobo doll experiment, and you will hear a lot about the Bobo doll experiment throughout your studies. I want you to watch this video. It is the original black and white, very scratchy video from 1963 about behaviour towards a doll. So we had these when we were kids. It's like a blow-up clown doll, a blow-up doll with a clown drawn on it. It can have anything drawn on it, but it was a clown doll. And it has like a sand weight in the bottom. So when you punch the doll, it bounces back up again. But what they were trying to do was establish what the children would repeat once they'd watched the adult behaving aggressively towards the doll. So I'll let you watch the video and then come back. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed watching the Bobo doll. The last one we're going to look at is mental disorders and crime. So as you can see there, you've got the headline on that newspaper there on The Guardian, Psycho Cabbies Rampage on CCTV. The media tend to use the word suffering. Someone is suffering from a mental illness. Mothers who killed their children are suffering from a mental illness. Well, overall, the thing is that those with mental illness are more likely to be victims of crime or more of a risk to themselves than other people. People with mental illness are not, on the whole, a risk to the community. There are some features of mental disorders that can cause people to commit crime, such as those who experience command hallucinations as part of a psychotic disorder. And these people are people that can't recognise reality, and they believe they're being told to do things, and so they go and do it. And this happens especially if they don't take their medications. And unfortunately, there are some people who have very, very severe mental disorders such as psychoticism or schizophrenia, who will take their medication and be feeling really good, so they feel, well, I don't need my meds anymore, I'm fine. And unfortunately, they will just go backwards and go down the hole again. And they can become quite dangerous, but again, often quite dangerous to themselves. So they are more likely to be victimised than offenders. In Australia, offenders with serious mental health disorders are subject to meeting strict criteria. They are diverted from the criminal justice system to a forensic mental health system. And when we do a forensic psych, we'll talk about what happens to people who end up as part of the system from having a mental disorder or trying to make an insanity plea. Okay, psychopath and psychopathy. Well, the cause of psychopathy is different than the cause of sociopathy. It is believed that psychopathy is the result, largely the result of nature, which is genetics, while sociopathy is more likely the result of nurture, which is the environment. Psychopathy is related to a physiological defect that results in the underdevelopment of the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and emotions. Sociopathy, on the other hand, is more likely the product of childhood trauma and physical or emotional abuse. Because sociopathy appears to be learned rather than innate, sociopaths are capable of empathy in certain limited circumstances, but not in others, and with a few individuals, but not others. They are both classified as personality disorders, and this is why they can kill many people. They're very antisocial. They will disagree with societal norms. Now, someone like Ted Bundy checked every feature on the list. He believed that he was much smarter than his lawyers, so he sacked them all and tried to represent himself. So it didn't work for him real well, but that's what happens when you have that. So they're terms that are used a lot, but in reality, a very small number of offenders will ever meet the diagnostic criteria for psychopathy. Okay, I know that one was a little bit longer, but we got through that. So I'll see you in tutorial and workshop, and next week we will move on to sociological problems of crime, or sociology, not social problems of crime, that's the difference.